I'm Piper. I am here in Jacksonville, Florida, which is northeast, and we're under a tornado watch. So it's very typical Florida weather. So I just wanted to let you all know. I'm at a private pre-K through postgraduate school here in Northeast Florida. We've got about 1,600 students in those grades, pre-K through post-grad. And as Jake mentioned, we've had a table, I think I figured it out. We may have had it for about 5 years at this point. Just for perspective, I wanted to let you know who uses this at our school. I teach an anatomy class and I use it obviously extensively in anatomy. Our biology classes use it. We have a psychology classes that have come in and used it. Latin, which was really awesome. I did a group project with Latin on the table. We've had our dance classes come in and use it. They learn about stretching and what they're stretching and why. We've had chorus come in and look at vocal cords. So that was amazing. Our 5th grade from our 2 lower school campuses come every year and they do a big unit on the table. We have also been able to offer basically after school programs for local local elementary school kids who don't have access to a table. So there's been some amazing outreach that our upper school students have been able to do with lower school, local public lower school kids. And we also use it in our summer camp. So that's essentially the gist of how we utilize it here at Bowles. I am going to show you a PowerPoint here in just a second. Then what we'll do is I'll run through, I have got about 3 kind of little mini lessons that you can do in short periods of time. And then I'll stop and answer any questions you might have. And then I'll show you 2 pretty big projects that we do. And I'll answer any questions after that. So I'm going to share my screen. So I'm hoping that everybody can see this at this point. So this is the title of this project, as I mentioned. These 10-minute takeaways, we're going to talk about deductive reasoning in the heart, application of knowledge in the skeletal system, and a discussion of the possible implications of a brain tumor. And I will talk a little bit more about them when this video is done. There's a little bit of my coworker talking in the beginning of this one. I apologize. I tried to cut it and it didn't work out. So just give it about 4 seconds and it'll kick in here. Turn it on and go ahead. 5, 4, 3, 2, go. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to show you all was just something that I do when I have 5 or 10 minutes of class. And it's actually not really so much an anatomy thing, it's a higher level thinking skill, which is what I love about the table, is that you can do really, really basic skills, but you can also do really advanced skills. So this is a skill I generally do before we go over the circulatory system with my students. You'll find this image under the high resolution images. When you look at the toolbar, and this is the female heart, and all I've done is made a transverse cut across it. And then I'm going to take my slider bar and just scale down until I can just get a really clear images of the ventricles. And so I'll say to my kids, again, this is generally before we've done any kind of deep dive into the circulatory system. I will say to them, you know, there's 2 pumping chambers called ventricles. There's one right there, and there's one right here. And I want them to use their powers of observation and to make an assumption or an inference as to which chamber pumps blood all the way out to the fingers and toes and back to the heart, and which one goes just to the lungs and back. And I will say what's really interesting about this is that generally the kids get it wrong. They almost always get it wrong. But what I love about it is that when you ask them later, they always get it right. And that's so often the case, right? When we get something wrong, we remember it a lot better next time. So just for reference, if anyone's wondering, they always say that this side is the one that goes to the body, to the head, and all the way back to the heart. And their assumption is that is because it has this huge space, this big cavity, but that's not actually accurate. So what I can do is I can come down here and show them the measurement tool, and then I can show them the width of that muscular wall compared to the width of, compared to the width of this muscular wall. And then they can really see, this is 6 millimeters roughly and about 25 millimeters. And then they can really see the difference. This, when you point it out to them, they're like, oh yeah. So again, a higher level thinking skill, just something that's a lot of fun for them to do, and something that they always remember later on. Another one that I use, so I'm going to get out of this and I'm going to pull up child mummy. So this is under the just the case studies. This child mummy, I often like to come to when we have covered part of the part of the skeletal system. So what I will do in this case is I'll come in here and I want a frontal cut. So I will come and kind of cut off part of this. And then I ask these kids, my students, to tell me roughly how old they think this mummy is by looking at the skeleton of this mummy. So again, we've already covered some of this skeletal system at this point. They know a little bit about growth plates. So actually I'm going to show you in the knees because it's a little bit easier to see. They can see, if they remember what I taught them, these growth plates are not fused. You can see the gap in here between these growth plates. And also you don't see any, well, actually just a little bit of the kneecaps starting to ossify right there and right there. So they can use that information to try and determine how old this kid is. And it's just a really amazing way to apply what they're learning to a real world situation. And also kind of cool because it's a mummy and we don't really talk a whole lot about mummies. You can see the growth plates down here also at the distal end of the femur, excuse me, at the distal end of the tibia and fibula. So that's another application piece. So that was for my kids to tell me how old the child was when they passed. Okay, here I've pulled up the Caucasian male. This is under the gross anatomy slides. This one takes a little bit longer to upload, but what I love about this is kind of another quick sort of one-off, is I will come in a lot of times and show the kids, and I do this actually with our 5th graders that come in. I'll come in and show the kids this particular scan. And what I like to do is make the skeleton a little bit translucent so that you can see the nervous system clearly, but you still have the reference points of the skeleton. And what I like to do is ask the 5th graders, you know, what do you see about this particular brain and spinal cord that maybe kind of stands out to you in this particular patient? And you have to give them a little bit of time because the 5th graders really haven't done, and actually sometimes I even do this with my junior and senior anatomy kids, but the 5th graders haven't really done as much anatomy. But oftentimes they will notice this protrusion right here. And I don't know if you're familiar, but this is the gentleman who was on death row who donated his body to science. And he was on death row, if I remember correctly, for murder. But we talk about this particular issue and what problems that potentially could have caused for him. That's, you know, what part of the brain is that? What is the function of that portion of the brain? What kind of problems could it have potentially caused for him? And if I'm correct in my memory, I don't think that he was aware that he had this. I think they found this post-mortem. So it's just kind of a very interesting sort of thought experiment to go through when you talk about what is the function of the brainstem, what would potentially happen if you had a big tumor in the brainstem, what might that do to your behavior, if at all. So this is just another kind of quick one-off that I like to do. And the 5th graders love this clear skeleton. They just think this part is very cool. What they don't particularly love are the eyeballs. So I usually do go in and remove them because the eyeballs freak them out. And my anatomy kids too, but you know, it's funny, my brother is a surgeon and he said that the one thing that he did not like about the cadaver dissection was the eyeballs. So I kind of get it. So at any rate, another kind of quick little 10-minute takeaway that you can do with the class if you are looking for a time filler is to pull up the Caucasian male and show them this particular discrepancy in his nervous system. And it generates some really interesting conversation. Okay, so what I started showing you, as I mentioned, was just little tiny snippets that you can do. There are a ton of them. I just highlighted 3. I should have mentioned also the brainstem one we talked about in psychology, the psychology course as well. And as another aside, the other thing that the 5th graders love to do is color the organs. So you can go in there and you can pick neon green for the stomach and yellow for the intestines. And the kids think that's really amazing. So I'm going to kind of change tracks, and I'm going to talk a little bit about two bigger projects. The first one takes about 6 hours of class time, and the other one's a little bit bigger. It's about 10 or 12 periods of 1 hour classes. So I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about the disorders project. This is a 3-part project. I've written the synopsis up here. Basically, the caveat to this is that they have to find something that has a physical manifestation, and then they do this project in 3 stages. In the first stage, they act as doctors. In the second stage, they act as biomedical engineers. And in the third, they act as marketers. And we can talk about research and development and a couple other things. So I'm going to go ahead and just show you the video for this one. Next, I'm going to talk to you about a project I do in anatomy that is a little bit more involved. The thing I've pulled up here came out of the case studies. This is an example of a gentleman that has a basilar aneurysm. Let's see if I can get it to show up here. There it is. So you can see from this image, this very, very large aneurysm right there. And so my kids have to pick a person on the table that has a physical manifestation of their disorder. So you have to be able to see it. They can't really pick cancer. There are a few scans, and I'm happy to send you all a list of what I found that works for this project. There are a few scans that kind of have a side effect from cancer that they can use, but for the most part, we're talking about fractures. We're talking about this kind of stuff. You could do stenosis. You can do arthrosclerosis in the veins. So there's a lot of different applications, and I'll show you a different one in just a second. But this is a 3-part project. And so in the first part, they have to act like doctors. So they need to research this. What does this blood flow do? What are these blood vessels called that we're looking at here? What parts of the brain are they supplying blood to? What happens if this thing were to burst? So they have to be the doctors in the first stage. In the second stage, they're going to be biomedical engineers. And so in that stage, they have to create a 3D fix for this disorder, and it has to be to scale. And so the really awesome thing about this is I bring in one of our amazing IT specialists, whose name is Gloria Wood, a shout out there, and she's helping me film this today. So I really appreciate her assistance. And she comes in and helps my kids with the CAD program that we use. And she helps them kind of visualize how you go about creating this. But they have to create a 3D fix, and it has to be to scale. Now, these 3D fixes are hard plastic fixes, so it's not super realistic, but the kids get to be able to kind of use their imagination and figure out how they would fix this. So I'm going to just show you another example of a patient that we use. This is a gunshot wound. So our students have done this one as well. So this gunshot wound, they would have to obviously look at the track of this for their doctor part. You know, what biological, what organs are in the way here? What part of the brain's in the way? How would this have affected the person, assuming they didn't die? And then they would create their 3D fix. The kids for this project created not the most sophisticated plate, which you can see this is a plate that would go right on top of that. This is not to scale right now. And so the last part of this project is the students have to go in and they have to create a marketing plan to sell their 3D fixes. So I have another plate here from some students who created a fix. This was for a patient who needed a plate right above the eye socket. So the kids would then have to go in, and it's an amazing way to talk about R&D. How do companies come up with price tags of their pieces, even though it may cost pennies to make? How come they come up with these really, really expensive pieces? And then who do you market to? Are you marketing to doctors? Are you marketing to patients? And what's the most efficient way and most effective way to reach your audiences? So that's a 3-part project that I do. It generally takes about, I would say, usually 2 class periods for each part. And then we have them present. So maybe a 7th class period for that last part. And our classes are an hour long here at Bowles. So I'm going to pause now to see if there's any questions, and then I'll resume with the big project after we have a question and answer session. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and play the next one, and then I'll address any questions because I'm going to show you this. So here on the left-hand side are just some of the different, sorry, let me pause this, it's a little distracting. Over here on the left-hand side of the screen are just some of the different scans that we've used to do this project. So you can see this would be a great project just for the skeletal system, for example. Oops, that just went on without me. And then over here on the right-hand side of the screen, I have the rubric that I use to evaluate this. So there's the medical portion that we talked about. And then there's the 3D model. So that's all, there's a rubric for all this so they can see what it is that they're being graded on. And then there's the advertising and the marketing that I was talking about, specifically the R&D. They have a hard time with that, but that's a really valuable part of that conversation. So I will go on to the last project. This is the conjoined twins project. This is a huge project. And what's really interesting about this project is when I first introduce it, the kids think I'm insane. And then at the end, they're like, oh, that was amazing. So basically I break them up into surgical teams and I put them in groups of 5. And then they are a specific doctor within that surgical team. And they have to come up with a plan to separate the twins. And I'll tell you a little bit more about it in this video right here. Okay, this project is probably the most in-depth one that I do, and this requires several days of class. It's usually about a 10-day, 10-hour in-class project, and it culminates in a presentation to surgeons, and actually I have found that's the hardest part, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in just a moment. So in a class of about 20, my anatomy classes are about 20, I take the students and I break them up into groups of 5, generally speaking, and each kid has a different job. So one might be a neurosurgeon, one might be a cardiovascular surgeon, one might be an orthopedic surgeon, but they all have distinctly different jobs. And then I introduce them to the conjoined twins. So this is in the case studies. These are 2 2-year-old females that were successfully separated in surgery. And so I show these teams of kids, these teams of quote unquote doctors, the twins. And on day 1, we talk about sort of life in the operating room. So what does an operating room look like? Who are the players in that room? Who's in control of that room? You know, for a surgery like this, you know, I have them kind of speculate how long do they think these surgeries take. There are a couple of YouTube videos that I have them watch. What I really want them to walk away with, the kind of the overarching mission of the first day is for them to understand that these kinds of surgeries are incredibly complex and that it is not, you know, a one and done kind of thing. Like the ortho doesn't come in and do his job and then go home and have a, you know, a sandwich, and the cardiovascular surgeon doesn't come in and do her job and then like go get a pedicure, right? So it's very, very complicated. So day 1, they're kind of getting their jobs and they're sort of looking at these twins. And then in day 2, what I do is I bring them in here and I have them take a look at this case study. So this is a case study. I will tell you it's written only for one of the twins, but you do have to have, there's a lot of creative license with this project. You kind of have to use this information and sort of extrapolate a little bit. But I print this case study off and I give them this information. And what they need to do is they need to go through this and kind of digest the information as it pertains to their particular job. So if they are the respiratory surgeon, they're not interested really as much in the the neurological stuff. Again, there is some overlap, obviously, but if they're the cardiovascular surgeon, they're not quite as concerned with orthopedic stuff. So they have to go through here and kind of read this and translate it. And this is written, you know, from a doctor perspective. So obviously some of this stuff is very complex and they have to go in and sort of take a look at it. And once they've done that, the next day, I put them all together in their doctor groups. So all the cardiovascular surgeons sit together, all the orthopedic surgeons sit together, and they look at their notes and they kind of make sure that their notes sort of make sense. So they all sort of found what they needed to find. And then the 3rd day, I bring them back in and then they have to write up a surgical plan. So how would they, knowing their job, how would they address the situation with these twins? And one of the things they have to think about is, where do you even start? You know, like I say to them, you can't just lop these kids in half and then fix them, right? So is your first incision up here? Is it here? Is it down here? are the twins going to be on this side? Like who's laying on the right side, who's laying on the left side? You can't obviously operate like this with them laying on top of each other. So the first thing they have to kind of think about is where is that first incision going to be? And I'll say for this, because this is a case study and not a fully segmented specimen here, you can really only filter, and there are different filters, and I can send you that information that are helpful, but you can't, remove just one bone, obviously. So the kids come in, and let's say you're the cardiovascular surgeon, you're going to write your surgical plan, and each one varies a little bit because now they're writing individually. So some kids say, I'm going to start with the vasculature in the intestines and then head in a superior fashion. Other kids say, I'm going to start superiorly and head in an inferior fashion, and they are, again, addressing those blood vessels that were specifically mentioned in this case study with these twins. And so they have to address each one of those major blood vessels and how they would fix them. So it's all pretty straightforward. Then you put those kids back into their surgical teams and you tell them, I want you to create a plan from start to finish that is going to be the surgical fix for these kids. So you now have to take all 5 of these points of view and try and figure out who's going to go first, and where are you starting? Who's going to go first? Who then steps in? And it's literally like a first, second, third, fourth, like they lay out this very methodical plan and they go in and say, a lot of kids like to start up here in the thoracic region, which is fine. And I should stop really quickly and say that when I explain this project, the kids are like, you want what? Like, you want me to do what? But what I say to them is I am much more interested in their evidence of thinking. That I'm much more interested in seeing that they thought through these problems, evidence of higher level thinking skills. I am much less interested in whether or not this is medically accurate. I'm obviously not going to hand them a scalpel and some kids, right? That's never going to happen here at this level. But what I want them to walk away with is an appreciation for how complex this is, and how much of a dance this is. Like one surgeon comes in and then steps away and another one comes in. Now, you probably know this, but in a general, or when they do separate surgical twins, there are 2 different teams. So there would be 2 cardiovascular surgeons, one for this kid and one for that kid, 2 orthos. This is another liberty I take. We just have one team that's doing both jobs. I have thought about doing it with 2, but I don't think it would work. So anyway, that process takes several days of them kind of sitting around a table, hashing out this plan, like, how is this going to work? Where are we going to start? Oh, if you cut this, well, what about that? And then also they have to do post-op notes. These kids are pigeon chest. You can see how their ribs kind of flare out. And so they have to figure out how they're going to fix that. Some kids choose to try and do that during surgery. Some kids go with braces, external braces. That's all stuff that they've researched. And then they put their plan together, as I said, start to finish. And then the most fun part of this is when the doctors come in. So a note on the doctors, I have a really hard time. I now have some great doctors, but in the beginning, when I was trying to find doctors, they really desperately wanted to come in and tell the kids what they had done wrong, which I appreciate because they're experts in their field, but these kids are not experts in their field. So what I kept having to reiterate to the doctors was, I just want you to help the kids kind of work through their thought process. Like, well, if you cut this there, did you consider this potential problem, right? So that was tough, trying to find what you want to do is, I am very fortunate to be in a private school and we have a lot of doctor parents. And so I looked for those parents, who are doctors, and I could say to them, pretend your kid's doing this project and you're trying to explain this to your kid, right? You're just really interested more in the upper level thinking skills. So on presentation day, my students come in and I have little doctor coats for them, and on their doctor coats, it's embroidered vascular surgeon and cardiovascular surgeon, and they get to wear their little coats and they stand around the table and they present their surgical plan to these 2 surgeons. Last time we did it, I had a neurologist and actually a guy, a peds doc who specializes in these kinds of surgeries. So that was interesting. And my kids present, and it's one of these projects that at first blush, when I get started, I always kind of do a check-in with my kids, and they will say to me, like, this is so confusing. I don't understand what we're supposed to be doing. I don't get it. And they're very frustrated. But in the end, when you do the post-project evals, they will say, this was the most amazing thing. I can't believe I presented to doctors and they talked to me and they understood where I was coming from. And, you know, it's really a transformative project as far as kids' development and maturity, and also just for their self-esteem. I mean, it's, you know, it is, and I should also probably clarify that my anatomy class is it's a regular level anatomy class. It's juniors and seniors. And so I will get a slew of different kids, everybody from the kid who is sure they're going to be a cardiovascular pediatric surgeon at the age of 17, right? And then the kid who's like, oh my gosh, I had to have a science, and so I took your class. So, you know, you take that gamut of kids, and inevitably at the end of the project, they all have really come to this conclusion that this was an amazing experience. The first year I did it, I will say, the very, very nice doctor said to me, do you think this is maybe a little bit too advanced of a project for them? And I said, well, yes, if you are assuming that they were going to be handed a scalpel, but they're not going to be handed a scalpel. I'm just trying to get them, you know, to see the big picture here. And then he was like, okay, all right, yeah, I see. So that was pretty funny. I felt like, oh, kind of maybe I failed here, but I will just say that it is a big project. It does take at least 10 class days, and that's 10 hours of class. The presentations generally take, well, I'd get them all into one class period just to be respectful of the doctor's time. But I do have a step-by-step lesson plan that is typed out for this, as well as all the supporting documents that I use when I do this, this particular project. If you're interested, you can just reach out to me. And that's my conjoined twin project. So I will take any questions. Well, before I take questions, I did want to show, these are my kids and their cute little doctor coats with their name tags, and they are getting ready to present. When they present, part of what they have to do is they have to utilize the table to present. So when they're talking to the doctor, they actually have to manipulate the table, put different scans on, show the doctors what part they're talking about, so that it's really evident that they know what it is they're talking about, and they're not just speaking, you know, out of hand. Here's one of my doctors. This is Dr. Aldana. He's amazing. He's a neurologist. And I will, again, I have doctors in my family that wouldn't come and do this because they just wanted to tell the kids what was wrong with their plan. And I kept saying, you can't do that. So this guy is fantastic. And he got it. He understood. He would ask the question, you know, those kind of probing questions to make the kids think more deeply. And this is just a sample plan. This is a plan that one of my groups came up with. So you'll see the step is the left-hand column. That's what they're doing. It's the surgeon who's responsible is in the middle column. And then why they chose that step in that order, and what things that they might be concerned about. So this is the conjoined, you can see it's quite lengthy. It'll kind of scroll through here. This is the conjoined project of all these different doctors and all these different kids, and all their different concerns. And so it just kind of keeps going here. So when they present to the docs, they kind of sit here and talk about all these different steps and stages from their doctor perspective, from what their issue is or their concern is. So that is that. So I'm going to stop sharing. I did want to mention a few other quick things. Something that I did not mention in the project is that when I put the conjoined twin project, when I pull up the twins, I will often split screen that with the Asian female cadaver, just so you can kind of do some comparative anatomy. Now, it's a little tricky because she's an adult and these are 2-year-old twins that we're talking about, so it's not ideal, but it is great for comparative anatomy. So they can see what the musculature ideally would look like, the structure of it, the rib cage, what that rib cage should ideally look like. And you can split the screen on the Anatomage table so the twins are on one side and the cadaver, you can't see the whole cadaver, but portions of it are on another side. So that's pretty spectacular. Another thing I wanted to mention is that I do make the kids practice and practice before I bring the doctors in, because it's kind of horrifying if they're not ready. And then another point that I wanted to make, and I see there's some questions in there, so I will try and address those really quickly, is that my students, I mentioned this a little bit, I really do have these kids who are convinced that they're gonna like be the next, what's the ER doc, like the Dr. McDreamy, like they're convinced that they're going to be like the next amazing neurosurgeon, and they may be, frankly. But then I also have kids that are like, I hate science and I have a body, so I'm here in anatomy. But they all love the table. They love it. They love to play with the table. They show me things that I don't, like, have never even discovered. They love to take pieces out, like organs out, and add them back in again. And just as a side note, that's another like 10-minute takeaway. A lot of times when I do body systems, I'll remove something like an organ and ask them to figure out what is removed, because a lot of times they will learn, like if they're figuring out the organs, they'll kind of memorize them in order, but they don't ever think about reversing it. So it's just another kind of takeaway.